afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. My fabulous Executive Director, Chris Costa, is joined by Zamawang Almemar, a fellow at the National Defense University. Zama is also one of our newest members of the advisory board of directors here at the Spy Museum. She has over a decade of experience supporting special operation forces in countering weapons of mass destruction as a program manager at the Department of Defense. She has produced numerous publications on spreading awareness about the chemical and biological threats from non-state actors and has conducted countless seminars and briefs to senior leaders and military commanders in the US and the international community. She has earned 3 master's degrees at various universities in the US, including a degree in biodefense at George Mason University with emphasis on global terrorism and the use and acquisition of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and high-yield explosive threats to national security. At the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, she earned her master's degrees in chemistry and mechanical engineering and conducted research focused on nanobiotechnology while teaching graduate courses in biology and mechanical engineering. Zama was born and raised in Iraqi Kurdistan during the Iran-Iraq War, where she fled the atrocities of the Saddam regime, seeking asylum in the United States in 1997. Her perspective today is going to be incredibly welcome. We have had a few tech issues, so I want to just let everyone in the audience know if we see some fuzziness or wrinkles, we apologize. We've done our best to work on that. Now, after Chris and Zama discuss the issues that are catching their attention, we'll turn to your questions. I know you're going to have a lot of them. If you've been here before, you know, please use the Q&A feature to write them in. I will do my best to get to as many of them as possible. We will try. Anyway, enough from me. Over to you, Chris.
Amanda, thanks for the great introduction. We are really excited to have Zama here, and I've got to tell everyone that I'm particularly excited about this program because of Zama's expertise in weapons of mass destruction. And that's what we're going to focus on today, and everyone will appreciate how relevant this topic is. And also, it's a topic we haven't spent a lot of time on in past spy chats, but I'll try to pull some of that together because we have covered some stories in the last few years. But I'm very excited to have Zama because of her expertise. Now, I want to note right up front that I've been doing a lot of media on the Israeli-Hamas war. I know that's of great interest right now. We couldn't have predicted that when we invited Zama. So we'll be able to handle some of those questions, or I will, when we get to questions and answers. But I do want to try to focus our attention on the important, crucial issue of weapons of mass destruction. And as a way of introducing some of the stories. So we're going to talk about CBRN, just to define chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons, although we'll focus less on nuclear weapons. It's really important because these are still considered low probability events across the world in terms of a threat to the United States and our foreign partners. But it's an important national security topic, as I've already alluded to. And it's important this time in this current context because international norms and other constraints to use these kinds of weapons seem to be lowered across the globe from Ukraine to non-state actors. And I'll reinforce that point with some of the stories that I'm going to cover down today. And let me lead in just to make that point. Even in Israel, President Herzog just this week confirmed that Israel found on one of the Hamas terrorists a instruction from a 2003 Al-Qaeda manual on a body of this terrorist, the directions for putting together a cyanide dispersion device. Albeit crude, it still underscores the idea that non-state actors want to use chemical weapons. That's the first story that really got my attention this week, and that's from an Axios report. There wasn't a lot of substance to it, but it was pointed out by President Herzog. It did have some legs and was reported widely in Israel. The next story is another story we haven't talked a lot about, but it goes back 10 years, and it was recently reported this summer, in fact, in August, a Washington Post story by Joby Warwick, who wrote a book that I've alluded to in reference before called Red Lines, and I'll fill in the gaps in a minute. But you recall that 10 years ago, Syria used weapons of mass destruction. In particular, it used sarin-filled rockets and directed at its own population. Now, interestingly, when Syria executed those attacks against innocent women and children, some 1,400 people died horrifically from that attack. Again, against Syrian civilians in Ghouta, Syria on August 21st, 2013. The interesting point is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, an international organization, was on the ground, so they were able to document and collect evidence. So what's the story after 10 years? After 10 years, nothing has happened to those in Syria that were responsible for executing that horrific act using sarin-filled rockets. Now, there's an argument to be made in this article that one of the reasons was Syria eventually destroyed some of its sarin-filled rockets and then focused on using other chemical munitions like chlorine gas against its population. Now, I know about that directly because I was at the White House when a decision was made to fire cruise missiles at the Syrian regime in the summer of 2017, actually the spring of 2017, as a result of Syria again crossing the red lines that it had already crossed back in 2013. So that's an important story. For some additional context, sarin gas was used by a cult. The cult was called Aum Shinrikyo, and in 1995, the world was shocked when this idiosyncratic cult used sarin gas in a subway system, and some 1,000 innocent civilians suffered effects from that sarin gas. In the end, 13 individuals actually died because of the disbursement of the agent, but it really underscored the risk to subways and closed-in spaces. And this was not a state actor, it was a non-state actor. So that's some important context. I actually talk about that with my students at Georgetown. We shouldn't forget about that attack. The leader of that cult was executed by Japan in 2018, as an aside. The next story that got my attention, it's a little dated, it was 2016, but I want to remind this audience that Special Operations Command here in the United States has a central role of synchronizing and coordinating the U.S. government's response to countering proliferation and weapons of mass destruction. The article was published in the Washington Post a few years ago, and it got my attention as I researched in anticipation of this talk today. And what's really, really important is the idea that we have talked about gray zones, and we talked about less scruples for non-state actors to use chemical agents. And what's important is these gray zone activities that are playing out across the world suggest that there may be more use of chemical weapons in the future in these gray zone environments. And I'll give some additional examples. Um, Actually, the next article reinforces that point. Again, another Washington Post article, another article by Joby Warwick that talked about an individual by the name of Sabawi, who was essentially an individual that was a chemical engineer, worked for Saddam. Ultimately, he began to work for al-Baghdadi and ISIS to develop a chemical attack capability for ISIS. So everyone here knows who ISIS is. What you may or may not know is, and I had forgot this, that ISIS actually perpetrated some, give or take a few, but 20 chemical attacks were perpetrated between the years of 2015 and 17. Again, my source on this is the Washington Post. Eventually, Salawi was killed on the battlefield, and that ended really ISIS's attack capability. The other point I want to make is this attack capability they were developing was planned, at least the intention was to take that capability and use it against European targets. And if you don't buy into that narrative, I want to tell you about another story that broke this past January, got my attention. This is a story that played out on the ground in Germany. Germany's security and intelligence services ended up arresting an individual from Iran. This was not, and this is important, a state-sponsored attack. At least the first assessment was this was a jihadist-inspired attack, but this was an Iranian that wanted to attack German targets. And in this particular case, the agents were going to be cyanide again and ricin, of course. A serious act of violence was preempted by Germany's quick response. I believe the brother of this Iranian was also arrested. So this just broke out this past January. And I also want to flag an article that Zama wrote, and we're going to put it in the links. She wrote it a few years ago, but what's important is it got my attention. It was about domestic preparedness, and it was generically a talk about the threat to, closed-in spaces like subways. And that was something that was important to me when I served at the NSC, a low probability event, and yet something we're still concerned about. We always have to focus, security professionals, intelligence professionals, on the possibility that state actors and non-state actors will vie to use some of these weapons. And finally, just to wrap up on my talk, my brief summary, I want to remind everyone that this year, and I haven't talked about it, is the 20th anniversary of the invasion of the second Gulf War in Iraq in 2003. And what's important for this discussion today is remember that WMD, the weapons of mass destruction, was the very reason that the United States marshaled forces to invade Iraq and secure what was thought to be a significant capability that Saddam enjoyed, because we knew he used chemical weapons against the Kurdish people, his own population as well. And at the same time, of course, famously, that was the pretext for war, and the United States discovered that much of that program, because of Iraqi deception, was no longer in play. And I point that out because just last week, while everyone, I think, tuning in today is familiar with a hospital that was attacked in the back and I'm talking about in Gaza, in the back and forth. The United States intelligence community, as I understand it, has judged that that in fact was an errant rocket that killed civilian casualties, but it was not fired by Israel. And what's important to note is some journalists suggested there was still a lack of trust hearing from Western intelligence services that judgment hearkening back to 2003. So that's a different issue, but it's important because we talk about strategic surprise, we talk about the intelligence community, we talk about judgments, but that's an example of the tension between sharing and belief from the population. For what it's worth, I believe that judgment that was laid out by Western intelligence services, and we can talk about that in questions and answers. And finally, we will also we'll share with this audience a lengthy email I did early on when this crisis in Gaza and in Israel played out on the hostage issues in my assessment early on. And some of those judgments have played out tragically. We'll see how the hostage situation plays out in the coming days, but I'm happy to talk about that. And I want to finally just plug the work that our team has done. Ambassador Carstens was actually quoted from our Spy Chat program in the Washington Post talking about hostages and the Qataris being involved in partners with working these issues. So sure enough, the Washington Post looked at our Spy Chat from our July talk and referenced that. And I'm proud of that because it just underscores the importance of sharing these issues with the public and the press. So I'm going to stop talking. That was a lot, but there's a lot to talk about. I'm going to turn to Zama and we'll hear from her. Zama, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. Most importantly, can you hear me loud and clear?
We can.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. Much appreciated. That was a lot of different topics across the board to cover, mainly focus on countering weapons of mass destruction. But of course, every single one is very important. And obviously, it's very important to this audience as well as they tune in. And so I want to make sure that I hit on every single topic that you talked about, and then we can elaborate on it some, while leaving some room for discussions and Q&A. And that's kind of my hope. So hopefully I won't go over too much. But before I do any of that, as I'm still currently in government, I want to make sure that I do my due diligence of putting out the disclaimer that any comments I make on this Spy Chat is going to be my own and my own only, and not the official position of the government or the Department of Defense. So I just want to put that out there up front. With that, there's, like I said, and as Chris mentioned, in terms of my background, I have been working on counter weapons of mass destruction areas for quite some time now. I wouldn't say I'm world-renowned expert, but I do know just a little bit about the topic. So I do hope to kind of elaborate on that here. I think my background is what really got me interested in the field itself. And we'll touch on that more as we go through it. But just to give you a little bit more background on what Chris mentioned earlier is that I was born during war. So that was kind of my upbringing for a good decade in terms of what I was getting used to. During the Iran-Iraq war, why that's important is because that's when Iraq first used chemical weapons on the Iranian soldiers. And that really, I mean, it turned the whole calculus around in terms of who was on the winning end of that war. And because of that, then Iran started manufacturing chemical weapons. Then it turned into biological and then nuclear, etc. But what's important about that is that Chris mentioned one of the topic areas was the chemical attack on Ghouta by the Assad regime. That was a critical point in history that it's very important to remember. And that took place, just 10 years ago in 2013. The reason why that was important to those, especially in the counter WMD or countering weapons of mass destruction field, is because those of us that have been in this field for a long time, our sole purpose is to be able to prevent crises and situations like that to where regimes use it. My particular purpose of being in this field is to not experience another crisis like I did under the Saddam Hussein regime. As Chris alluded to earlier, the Saddam regime used chemical weapons. He had a very advanced chemical weapons program. As I mentioned, he used it on Iran. But then in 1988, he used it on the Kurdish population. And the Kurds are obviously a large population that live within Iraq. And during the Saddam era, that was one of the ways to, that he was able to suppress the Kurdish population. And he ended up killing 5,000 Kurds in 1988 in the city of Halabja. The city of Halabja was actually just, about 40 miles from where I lived and where I grew up. He didn't just stop there. The psychological impact that chemical weapons attack had on us as Kurds living in northern Iraq was one where we were always wary of when the next attack was going to be. In those terms, we were always prepared. We knew, where to have the masks. We knew to pack them with charcoal as to filter it out because we didn't have the regular masks that you would use to filter out the chemicals in case of a chemical attack. And we always knew that if there was a certain type of smell that related to a chemical, that we would go to the highest point of the home to be able to protect ourselves. One of the things that Saddam had figured out was that if you go to the highest point of the house, then you are at that point very much exposed to these chemical attacks. And as very much exposed, I should say, to the airstrike. So as you ran from the chemicals to the highest point in the house, then he conducted airstrikes on us, and then we would get bombed. And of course, we were exposed. Those who weren't able to run away from his airstrikes quick enough, really got in the line of fire and died. Those who were able to run away in time and get to the basement or the safe room, as we called it, every house had a safe room. At that point, there was so much resuspension of the chemicals from the chemical weapons attacks that he conducted that a lot of people died from that resuspension, being exposed to that. And so he had figured out a way to be able to kill as many Kurds as he could, to include during the Anfal campaign, which killed 182,000 people. And that was just almost like the Nazi concentration camps type of stuff that he did. So as you can imagine, as Kurds, this was one of the psychological impacts that we kept living with year after year, especially after seeing all that casualty in Halabja in 1988. So when the Assad regime conducted the searing attack in 2013 on the town of Ghouta, that was a wake-up call to a lot of us. That was the second biggest, largest casualty. 1,400 people died, were killed because of that chemical attack. It was one of those where we thought we had already left it behind by one of the regimes and we had taken care of that regime, but here we are again, chemical weapons being used by the Assad regime. So that was certainly a wake-up call, and especially I think, Chris, you alluded to that earlier in terms of the inspectors being there from the UN that day, that very same day that he conducted those chemical weapons attacks. So that was a very interesting situation for a lot of us who had spent quite a bit of time in the field. What I will say, and I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I will go back and touch on all the different topics that Chris touched on. Importantly, when ISIS showed up in 2014, and within 6 months, they were able to use chemical weapons. Guess on who? On the Kurds again for the first time in Iraq and Syria. This wasn't just a coincidence. ISIS had already gotten their hands on the chemical weapons that they could find from the remnants of war from the Saddam regime. It's important to note that there's been a lot of different reports that have come out, none classified, that I speak to here, that talk to these individuals, particularly the Sabawi, or the objective name Abu Malik, that was leading the chemical weapons program for ISIS. He essentially was one of the ones that came up through the ranks of the Saddam regime. So he was from the Ba'ath Party. He was under Saddam monitoring and had oversight over his chemical weapons program. What was interesting was that a lot of those individuals that were part of these programs ended up having been from the Saddam regime era. And that's important because as the US, you look at you mentioned the 20-year anniversary of, I would say US liberation. I would never call it invasion of Iraq. I think that made it to where it really left some folks feeling like they no longer had that belonging. You think about it, this is dictatorship. So we lived under dictatorship. And as part of the most powerful authorities under that dictator being part of the Ba'ath regime and the Saddam Hussein regime, these folks then had no power as they were disbanded and disassembled by the US Army. And so at this point in time, they had nowhere else to go to, but rather either join Al-Qaeda or form what was led by Baghdadi, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, that formed ISIS eventually. And so ISIS wasn't something new. A lot of people thought it was a brand new entity, organization that was created. It really had been in the background, created by most of the individuals that were disbanded and now were disgruntled and very much against the democracy that the US was bringing into Iraq, which it wasn't used to. It was full of corruption, etc. I call it liberation of Iraq. It's important for that connotation to stick because a lot of us up until that point, and of course I have a biased opinion, so I was born and raised in Kurdistan, Iraq, so that's the northern part of Iraq. It was always a different part of Iraq. We never felt like we were part of Iraq. And it's important to make that distinction because it goes with the culture, the language, the religion, what we believe in. We've always aligned very well with the US ideology of spreading democracy, and believing in democracy and believing in our Constitution. What was important when the US came into Iraq and essentially, with a lot of the negative side of war that always happens with the casualties and collateral damage, there was the good thing of being able to rewrite the Constitution based on American values. If you live in America, it's very easy to say, this is our Constitution, this is what we believe in, because that's what you've always known. For us living under dictatorship, who uses chemical weapons, who had threatened us with using nuclear weapons, because he led us to believe that his programs were extremely advanced and it was something that he could easily use. The repercussions of that were we believed that he would either use it on us, meaning the Kurds, or that he would use it against one of the other nations, whether it be the United States, which he believed very much that he was an equal to, or against one of the other nations. And that we would then be the casualties, the collateral damage of that war. And that was a very scary thing to us. But it's important to note that that was something that he led us to believe the many years that we lived under his dictatorship. So when the US came and they were implementing a lot of those American values and especially rewrote the Iraqi Constitution, that was one where it had a lot of American values, and those to this day, I think, stay a part of are a pillar of what Iraqi government is kind of going by. And I think we've seen a lot of that collaboration between the US and the Iraqi government, but of course, most certainly in Kurdistan. So I will go back to one of the things that was mentioned about the ISIS chemical weapons attacks. Of course, as they used this, this was, again, they had already learned from the Saddam regime using chemical weapons during the 1988 Halabja attack. But also, let's not forget, it wasn't just one instance. He actually used it throughout the early 90s. And that's how me and my family got acquainted with exactly what to do, what protocol, what techniques to use to protect ourselves from those chemical weapons. And as that was being used again by ISIS in 2014 and then so on, it was one of a psychological impact. So even though we weren't directly impacted, it was one that where we lived a lot of those instances where we were chemically attacked. And so, as you can imagine, as somebody who is in the countering weapons and mass destruction field, as myself, and the whole reason why I got into the field was to be able to counter some of those regimes like Saddam or Assad, it was one where I had a calling to then go do something about it. And of course, that's where a lot of the my experience with the Special Operations Command comes in terms of going forward and then supporting the teams and being able to train and equip a lot of them with the counter WMD equipment and detection. And that was important because one of the things that we noticed it in Syria with some of those chemical attacks. We also noticed it in Iraq, where ISIS was using chemical weapons. The indigenous forces on the ground just did not have the proper equipment to be able to detect those chemicals. As you can imagine, the United Nations or the international community, it takes time to get in there. Even with the Israel-Hamas war currently, it takes time for reporters and individuals to get there to be able to then report on these different stories. I would say it was less so during the 1980s. The only reason why we even have pictures and videos of what took place was because of an individual, a videographer that happened to be there that captured the atrocities and then released it to the United Nations and the international community. But during the ISIS war, it was even it was a little bit easier because of social media, but it was also difficult because they just didn't have the detection equipment, the sensors, to be able to then tell if this was against the organization of or the Chemical Weapons Convention. And a lot of these chemicals, if they're against the Chemical Weapons Convention, then they would have to go to the International Criminal Court at The Hague for being tried. Well, how do you try a terrorist organization? That's ultimately what it came down to. Chris mentioned this a little while ago about individuals trying to, or families being impacted by chemical attacks who are still to this day trying to get justice. That is also happening for some of the members that were impacted by the chemical attacks that ISIS conducted. To this day, they are still trying to get justice and going through the International Criminal Court to the ICC to be able to try these individuals. Now, a lot of them were killed during the anti-ISIS campaign by the US-led coalition. However, I think that justice should be served, and that's one of the things that a lot of these families are still fighting for in terms of being able to then bring some of those individuals to be tried. This has also been difficult, as Chris may have noted earlier, that trying regimes is a little bit more difficult than trying non-state actors. And I would also, like I mentioned, it is also very difficult to try non-state actors because we don't necessarily have a particular rule of law that we can push against a non-state actor to be able to put them in jail, but you can always find nuances in there. For the regimes, however, such as the Assad regime, which continuously seems to threaten his own population with chemical attacks and other types of attacks, I think it's important to note that that is something where we have to really work on holding these regimes accountable. Again, there's a reason why a lot of us are in this field, is to make sure that instances like that do not happen again. It has a huge psychological impact to the point where, to this day, thinking about the pictures and thinking about what happened to us and all the different instances where we just had to run for our lives and survive those different situations, that stays with you for life. However you want to term that or coin that term, it stays with you for life. And that's an experience that doesn't go away just because time passes. So you ultimately want to do something about it. And I think that that's where I have found my calling in this situation. I would say that it's the Biden administration earlier this year. This is a public release that they released there back in March of 2023. They published their national security memorandum to counter weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and advance nuclear and radioactive material security. And in that, they outlined a lot of the risk assessment for okay, we can't be everywhere at the same time, right? I mean, the special operations community is the tip of the spear when it comes to anything counterterrorism. And of course, since 2017, since they were given the authority to lead, to be the authority to synchronize and lead the counter WMD efforts and activities, they can't be everywhere at the same time. And as you're seeing, the world is just a flurry of different situations and issues going on in terms of, you've got the Russia and Ukraine war, you have the Israel and Hamas war. There are wars all over, whether it be small that we don't hear about or larger ones like the ones that we very much is on our TV every night. That is one where it's important to note that we can spread them too thin. That is a very good possibility. And so it's looking at where do we take risks? If we have all these countries that are of concern to us, how do we not attack them in the real term, but how do we tackle those different problem sets? How do we go at? Yes, sir.
No, Zama, I didn't want to interrupt you. This is riveting, and we never get the kind of personal insights you have and what drove you into countering the proliferation in counter-proliferation domain. But we have so many questions that I just want to pause there and see if we can go to questions and give you just a minute. I did the same thing to Director Ray, so it's indelicate, but I think folks want to ask questions and they're queued up, but I think we could listen to you all day because of your experience, and you did answer a calling, and it's very, very evident. But Amanda, how many thousands of questions do we have?
700,000. No, we do have a ton of questions, and
Sorry
people
about that.
are blown away by your personal and professional expertise, Zama. So they are very interesting and sort of different questions than I expected, and they've been coming in throughout. So here's an early one. Given the increasing global conflicts the U.S. is engaging in, what is the likelihood that foreign bad actors are attempting to distract us with those smaller concerns to then go after us directly when we are spread thin? And Chris has been warning us about this.
Yeah, I
Yes.
can.
So
Go ahead, Zoma.
go ahead.
You want me to tackle it?
please go ahead and then I can respond, or whatever we want to do. Yep.
So I truly believe in the idea that the United States has to focus on great power competition to counter China, to counter Iran, certainly to counter Russia. But that doesn't mean war. It means countering them in terms of economic strength and in terms of protecting our technology, which Director Ray and the Five Eyes have talked about, and we'll focus more next month with a Brit, somebody with a great deal of experience. But at the end of the day, the United States is engaged in great power competition, make no mistake. But that doesn't mean there won't be a black swan event, meaning some kind of attack while we're focused on other things, like right now trying to arm and assist and work with Israel to help them in the situation they are currently involved in. Plus, there's a humanitarian crisis. And I would make the distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people. There's a humanitarian crisis. At the same time, Israel is trying to destroy justifiably Hamas terrorists. All of that said, I have been warning for the last 5 years about the idea that the United States could overcorrect and pivot away from our need to continue to focus on the terrorism threat. Where we are right now changed the whole calculus watching how Hamas acted against Israel, not only from a strategic surprise standpoint, but also the idea that it harkens back to some fears that the United States and other actors have had from the use of chemical weapons. So our adversaries are relentless. So this just underscores the idea, and to answer directly, that we have to somehow balance our capabilities to focus on the entire waterfront. So that's how I would answer that question. And yeah, we're going to be spread too thin. Zama, any thoughts?
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add on to that is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Amanda shared the link to one of my publications. I've got numerous ones regarding chemical weapons attacks and weapons of mass destruction in general. But one of the things that I would add, and that I have always harped on, is this idea of a lone wolf attack. You know, the second we take our eyes off of the situation domestically, you've got a lone wolf attack who is being radicalized online by propaganda from whatever terrorist organization. Then those are the ones who are going to attack us at home. And that's something that, you know, at every government agency, I think has been kind of taken a hard look at. And the primary reason why I published that particular piece that I believe is in the chat, is the reason for having a vigilant public, because again, we cannot, the Special Operations Command, as well as the US government, cannot be everywhere at all times. So obviously we need the public to be able to be vigilant, to report certain anomalies that they see. You know, we used to be a lot more vigilant right after 9/11, and that kind of dissipated. I wish we could go back to that, not for any reason that we get any kind of black swan situations happening again, but that we just need to be able to do that, because there are a lot of things happening in the world, and we cannot take our eyes off of the lone wolves.
Well said.
Amanda?
Yes. Yeah. So we have two excellent questions from the same person, and I hate when I have to pick, but I'm going to go with the one that I anticipated getting and may ask the other if there's time. Do you think the failure of Israel to detect the Hamas attack is due to a lack of human intelligence? Human, meaning spies.
Thank you very much for that question. I will respectfully turn that over to Chris.
So That's a great question. So I don't think it's principally based on human intelligence. I think in the aftermath of 1973, the strategic surprise that shook Israel to the core when Arab neighbors attacked Israel, and Israel was on the defensive, and it turned out to be a significant strategic failure in the ability to analyze the intelligence that was collected. Bear in mind, at the time, Israel had significant human penetrations of Egypt, at least the open source reporting that I have read, and they still in 73 suffered strategic surprise. And in the aftermath of that strategic surprise, a commission was stood up called the Agronaut Commission that looked at every level of failure. And it turned out to be, in total, a failure to assess the amount of intelligence and take seriously the need for the appropriate warning intelligence. And Egypt had dulled the senses of Israel's shield, if you will, by constantly moving people towards the Suez Canal and doing other things. And eventually it looked like it was the crying wolf syndrome. And there's a cost associated with that. Now, I don't know when there'll be a reckoning of the intelligence establishment. But there's already an acknowledgement that they have failed abysmally, and Israel will reassess their capabilities in the aftermath of a strategic failure that they themselves are already acknowledging. That's going to come later. Israel saying they are focused first on the military operations to destroy their adversary, again, Hamas terrorists. All of that said, I predict that when the final analysis is done and when that future commission report lays it out, the intelligence was there. It was a failure to act on the intelligence, to include human intelligence. Because remember, for 2 years, Hamas has been rehearsing this, and in some cases, wide open. So they were training in the open, and yet the senses of Israel was dulled for whatever reason. So yeah, there's going to be a reckoning. I don't think that time should be now if the Israelis were listening to me, but that's how I see it.
Okay, I'll just make a follow-on comment to that. I will say that not addressing the particular question, but more so the humanitarian crisis that resulted from that situation. Having been a victim on that side of desperately needing humanitarian support, it is one where I feel for the people who are caught in between, either on the Israeli side, like the Israelis, the Palestinians, whomever they are, whatever color, gender, age, whatever they are, it is the humanitarian situation that results from it that you become the victim of war, whatever that war may be, and there is no getting out of it. I will give you a very quick example in terms of during the Iran-Iraq war, where one of my relatives was very much that. He was a collateral damage. He happened to take fire from the regimes that were fighting against each other. Nothing to do with the government, not just passing through, and the entire family took an RPG in their car. So, you lose family, it's a loss of life that results from that, whoever that may be, whatever population that may come from. Over.
This one is really interesting to me in your wheelhouse, Sama. To what extent is human, as opposed to other forms of intelligence, important to the detection of CBRN weapons programs? Any examples of successes in this regard that you can tell us?
That is an excellent question. So I will say, it's very important. Well, this is a spy chat, right? So I can say this. Human is very important. Human intelligence is perhaps one of the, in my opinion, my biased opinion, I think is one of the most important areas of intelligence collection. And the reason being is because to this day, being an old-fashioned individual, I I think that technology is excellent. It can tell us a whole lot of things about different situations, but it all comes down to that human being on the ground who can really assess the situation. I'll tell you just from personal experience, nothing from reports or anything that I have seen or that, I'm releasing here. But in terms of being on the ground during the anti-ISIS campaign and when ISIS was conducting those chemical weapons attacks, the assessment that I was able to conduct being on the ground and looking at the craters that those chemical attacks created and talking to the individuals, to the indigenous forces, as well as our U.S. forces that were impacted by the remnants of the chemical weapons. It was nothing like I could have gotten by any means back back at home. And that is very important. That is a very personal experience to me that told me right then and there that human is the most important tool in our toolkit when it comes to those types of situations, whether it be countering weapons of mass destruction or some of the wars like what we're seeing currently occurring.
So we didn't rehearse that, but that makes my heart go pitter patter. Thanks for saying that, Zama, the importance of human intelligence. I can just say kind of, I'll be rather opaque about this, but I did handle a source that found in what looked like a chemical agent, and we appropriately took some action, and turned out to be a non-chemical agent. But at first blush at the time, we really thought we were dealing with something that was a significant threat. That happens, but had it not been for a human source, we would never had the opportunity to do the inquiry that we did to protect U.S. troops broadly. I do want to make a point. You're going to hear about this next week. For all the folks that I hope tune in to Spy Chat, next month, I do want to point out a book that I'm reading now. If you're interested in human and understanding how human factors into these threats, there's an outstanding book that was just published called Targeting Tehran. It's very, very appropriate to what's happening on the ground in Israel right now, and also how Israel collected human against Iran's would-be nuclear program. So just keep that in mind. We'll talk about that more next month. Over to you, Amanda. I know we only have 6 or 7 minutes left.
Yeah, and we have some two questions I really want to get to. One, always of interest, and you knew it finally got interesting when a James Bond movie focused on this. How do you think the international community can best deal with private financiers of terrorist groups? And it doesn't seem that sexy to people, but if you can trace the money, stop the money, how can the community work on this?
What I will say is I'll hand it over to Chris to elaborate on it. But one of the most important things is always follow the money. You hear that everywhere, and that is extremely true when it comes to terrorist organizations, but also that would be non-state actors, but also for state actors. So wherever it is, whatever the problem set is, always follow the money, and you will end up somewhere. And being able to disband or dismantle that network is going to lead you to certain outcomes that you are trying to achieve. Chris?
Yeah, I would just offer not only follow the money, but follow the trafficking of illicit dual use items that can be used to support proliferation of banned chemicals, banned biological agents, because there's a market for that. So one of the most valuable people I had on my team, and they were all valuable, believe me, was the individual that understood counter financing or financing and going after terrorism finances, and understood treasury tools, understood the critical nature of sanctions as another tool. We frequently talk about kinetic tools, but there's diplomatic, there's military, and there's sanctions and tracking money. And there's at least one person on this spy chat that worked for formerly Homeland Security of investigations, and they were very good at tracking those illicit items and the market for shutting down those networks. So it's all interrelated, not just financing, but proliferation of illegal activities to proliferate, and equipment and tools.
The dollars, the money, the
Right.
cash. Final quick question to scooch in here. Do either of you have any thoughts on the Iranian spy or agent of influence in the Pentagon's Office of Special Operations?
I am one to say I don't know. I can't provide any information on that simply because I don't know.
Yeah, same here. I'm not familiar with it, and I'm not tracking that case. It's something I'll follow
Yeah,
up on, but it might be something we don't have access to.
yeah, I think there was an article in the Post or the Times, but I also just glanced over it. So they stumped us. They stumped the panel. My goodness.
Happens.
So I
Should
will
not have
say, I mean, I
squished.
read the same article and understand that there was this, Iranian spy supposedly that was a government official that was working at the Pentagon and really came out, and once they were charged, they said that they were an Iranian spy. But other than what was published in the news media, there's nothing more that I know about it.
Yeah, and I've heard, well, I don't even want to talk about what I've heard because I haven't read it yet in any of the articles. So that's a great question. You did stump us, and I appreciate that, and that's okay. We've covered a lot. I do have a reclama. I didn't recommend a book or a movie today, so I want to go to my notes and reference an excellent movie and an excellent book. The book is American Prometheus: The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, of course, the father of the atomic bomb. I thought the book, although it is a tome, it is voluminous, it reads very well, and I enjoyed it. It provided a lot of context for me. It took some time. I had to travel to the Middle East and back to finish that book, literally. It's outstanding, and the film was powerful. I recommend both the film and the book if you all have time to do both. But I think it's a powerful story. And remember, I didn't talk about the Ukraine. I didn't talk about the fact that that's come up in the news, the idea of a pretext where Russia would suggest that Ukraine was preparing a radiological bomb, a dirty bomb, and that would be a pretext to use tactical nuclear weapons. Remember that story? We talked about that here. So the idea of nuclear capabilities is not off the table. It's something we have to consider, we have to keep talking about, and we have to educate ourselves. So I wanted to just remind folks that those are two interesting stories, or one interesting story to see it in two different mediums. Over to you to wrap up, Amanda.
Yeah. So I will just make a quick comment, Chris,
Sorry.
on that. So Oppenheimer, the villain or the hero, right? That's the question of the day. And you can see it either way, because truly, I mean, the movie really did a phenomenal job kind of explaining his entire stature and just how he went about kind of looking at it from the scientific point of view, and then looking at it from the national security perspective. And, you know, as scientists, it's hard to cross that line because you're just a scientist. But really, I think the one thing that it attributed to is our nuclear deterrence. And that's all I have to say on that. Amanda?
Well, thank you both. This has been incredibly riveting. We will be posting this program on our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again or tell your friends and colleagues. And please check out our website calendar for upcoming programs. We have things for people of all ages and both in person and virtual. And if you love this program, please consider making a donation to Ye Old Spy Museum. Our donors make these kind of programs, free programs available. Also, they help us do community outreach, let children come to the museum for free, do exhibit improvements, and take care of our collection. So thanks everyone for watching and listening. And Zama and Chris, this has been incredible, just
Thank you,
incredible.
Zama. Thank you, team.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zama.